Ever catch yourself, like, talking slower to your smart speaker?
Uh-huh.
Like it's, I don't know, a toddler or something?
Yeah.
Turns out I'm not alone.
Right.
How we talk to machines, it's like a whole rabbit hole of weird. And the research article we're diving into today, Linguistic Analysis of Human-Computer Interaction, gets into all of it.
Yeah, it really gets into the nitty-gritty of how our brains are approaching these interactions, which is fascinating.
So it's not just me who breaks out my best customer service voice for Alexa.
Not at all. No, it's actually like a real thing, device-directed speech.
Okay.
We tend to speak slower. We get louder when we're talking to machines, almost like we're aware that they might need some extra help.
Right, like they won't get our slang
Exactly, yeah.
or sarcasm, all that.
Yeah. But you know what's even more interesting?
What's that?
It's how kids do this.
Oh, really?
Kids, who are still learning language themselves, will hyper-articulate even more than adults when they're talking to Alexa or Siri.
Wait, really? So it's not just them trying to sound like robots?
Well, maybe a little bit of that, but some linguists think that it could be their way of compensating for what they see as the device's limitations.
Mm.
They're still figuring out all those, like, social rules of communication.
Right.
So maybe they overemphasize to make sure that they are understood.
See, that's kind of adorable.
It's cute.
It's like these tiny humans trying to, like, outsmart the machines before they even really understand how to work.
Yeah, totally.
Okay, but what about how machines talk back to us?
Okay, yeah.
Do those robotic voices actually change how we speak?
So there's this whole other concept called vocal alignment.
Okay.
And that's basically where we subconsciously mirror the speech of, whoever we're interacting with.
Hmm.
But here's the thing.
Yeah.
Studies show that we actually align less with synthetic voices.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it's like our brains, they recognize that there's this fundamental difference between, a human talking to us and a machine.
So even though I might, like, slow down my speech for Alexa, it's not going to start imitating my Philly accent.
It's definitely more nuanced than that, I'd say.
Right.
Like, we might not start talking full-on robot,
Right.
but studies have found that things like the age and the gender, both of the user and the device, can influence how much we align.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Like, there's been research to show that older adults actually tend to align more with older-sounding voices,
Yeah.
even when those voices are synthetic.
Wow. So it's almost like our brains are, like, hardwired to find some kind of common ground, even if we're talking to a machine.
Yeah, exactly. Like, we're trying to connect, even if it's, with something that's not human.
Right.
But it makes you wonder, though, if our brains are so sensitive to these subtle cues, are we also bringing our own biases into how we hear and interpret these voices?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, we all have our own baggage and our own, experiences that shape how we see the world.
Exactly, yeah. And unfortunately, research kind of suggests that our brains don't just, like, switch off those biases just because it's a device we're talking to.
Really?
So, for example, there were these studies where people listened to different Siri voices,
Okay.
and they were asked to identify, like, the race and the gender of the voice just based on the sound.
Wait, so they could, like, tell which Siri voice was black or female just by listening?
Yeah, and these weren't even human voices, remember?
Right, it's synthetic.
They were all synthetic.
So how did they even figure out how to, like, make one sound more black or, I don't know, more female?
Well, they used a bunch of different voices, each with these tiny little variations in pitch and tone, pronunciation.
Okay.
And they asked the listeners to identify, the race and gender of each one.
Got it.
And what they found was kind of troubling.
What's that?
Listeners weren't just randomly assigning these identities.
Okay.
They were associating specific vocal qualities with specific racial and gender groups.
This is where I'm guessing those biases really come into play.
Exactly.
Okay.
The Siri voice that was most often perceived as black and male was also the one that was rated as the least competent, the least friendly, less trustworthy compared to the others.
Wow. That's really disheartening to hear.
Yeah, it's really concerning.
Yeah.
It highlights how, even these technologies that seem neutral on the surface can actually perpetuate really harmful stereotypes.
Just by, reflecting the biases that they were, like, trained on?
Exactly. They're learning from us.
Yeah.
And we're not always the best role models.
So even if the technology itself isn't intentionally biased, our own perceptions, the way we've coded those voices, it can have these, like, really problematic outcomes.
Yeah, it's complicated.
That's a lot to process.
It is.
Wow.
And it gets even more complex when you consider how our own, like, preconceived notions about machines, what we already believe about them, can influence how we hear them in the first place. There's this concept called top-down processing.
So, wait, hold on. You're saying that, like, my brain could actually be making it harder to understand what a machine's saying just because I think it's going to be difficult.
Yeah, kind of.
Okay.
It's like, have you ever watched a movie, like, with subtitles, but it's in a language you don't understand at all?
Sure. Yeah.
So think about this. If someone tells you, like, this movie, it's a super complex drama, lots of twists and turns,
Yeah.
you're probably going to assume those subtitles, they're getting full of these big words, complicated grammar, right?
Probably.
But what if instead they're like, oh, it's a really lighthearted comedy, just silly fun. You might expect the language to be a bit simpler, easier to follow, right?
Yeah, I guess so.
Just that expectation alone, that can totally change how closely you pay attention, how easy it is to understand what you're reading,
Yeah.
even if the subtitles themselves are exactly the same.
Right, right. Our brains like to take shortcuts. They
Exactly.
use what we already know to make sense of new stuff. But how does that, like, actually play into this whole voice recognition thing?
Right, so with AI and all that,
Yeah.
well, there was this study, and they found that just telling people a voice was from a machine, synthetic,
Mm-hmm.
it actually led to them getting lower scores on intelligibility tests.
No way. Even if it was, what, the same audio?
Yeah, just believing it was a machine made it harder for them to understand what was being said.
Wow, that's wild. So it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy almost. We expect machines to be harder to understand, so we end up proving ourselves right.
Exactly. It's like our brains are working against us a little bit.
Wow.
And this isn't just, some weird psychological thing either.
Right.
This has real implications when we're talking about developing things like, what's it called? Automatic speech recognition.
ASR.
Yeah, ASR, exactly.
That's how we get our phones and our smart speakers to do our bidding.
Exactly. It's how
Yeah.
machines take what we say and turn it into text commands, all that.
Right, right.
And, don't get me wrong, ASR has gotten really good.
Yeah.
But it's still not perfect,
Mm-hmm.
especially when you think about how diverse human language actually is.
So you're saying my southern drawl might be throwing off my poor voice assistant this whole time?
It's definitely possible. You see, most of these ASR systems, they're trained on tons and tons of data, right?
Right.
But, and this is the issue, that data often skews toward what people consider standard language, whatever that means.
Mm.
So that means that folks with different accents, people speaking different dialects, or even people with speech impediments, they might get misrecognized way more often.
So it's not just about the technology itself being, I don't know, good or bad at its job. It's about whose voices it was trained to understand in the first place.
Exactly. It's like whose communication counts as normal,
Right.
and that's a big problem. That bias baked into the data itself, that can have some pretty major consequences for how this technology is used, who benefits from it. Like, just imagine a world where certain voices are constantly being misunderstood or ignored by technology just because they don't fit into this narrow idea of standard.
Yeah, that's incredibly frustrating. Like, it shouldn't be that way.
It shouldn't.
Actually, this reminds me of that article. It touched on some of these ethical concerns too, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Right.
One of the big things it highlighted was just how few languages are actually supported by commercial text-to-speech systems.
Right, right.
We talk about technology making the world more connected, but the reality is a lot of language communities are being left out of that loop.
So wait, so beyond accents and dialects, we're talking entire languages that are excluded from these advancements.
Yeah, basically. And if you're relying on translation systems that don't really understand the nuances of a language, that could have some really big real-world effects, especially for languages that are less common, or maybe there just aren't as many resources available for them.
Right, right.
It's almost like the algorithm's playing favorites.
Wow.
And if your language isn't seen as important enough to include, well, tough luck, I guess.
That's a scary thought.
Yeah, it is.
It's like we're creating this, what, a digital divide that's not even just about access to technology, but whose language is considered worthy of being heard in the first place,
Exactly. Whose voice matters and whose gets silenced.
It's more than just words on a screen.
It is, and that's exactly why you need linguists, researchers who get that, who understand language variation involved in this process.
Right, because they're the ones who get that language. It's so much more than just words and grammar rules, right?
Exactly. It's culture, it's identity, it's history,
Yeah.
all wrapped up in how we communicate. And if we want technology to truly reflect the richness and diversity of human experience, Well, it needs to start reflecting that in the tech itself, or else we're just going to make these inequalities even worse. It's not enough to just make tech available. It needs to be inclusive, accessible for everyone.
That's a really good point. So we've talked about how we talk to machines. We've
Right.
talked about how those machines are hearing or maybe mishearing what we're saying. But it sounds like there's this even bigger question here, right? About like the whole foundation of these technologies, who they're actually designed to serve in the first place. It's like we're at this point where like on one hand, we have all this amazing potential to use this technology to, I don't know, break down communication barriers, actually connect with people all over the world in ways we never could before. But then at the same time, it's like if we're not really careful, we could just end up making all those inequalities we see already even worse.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really, really good way of putting it. And it kind of brings us back to what we were talking about earlier, how our own biases can shape how we interact with this tech. Because if we're not like actively trying to identify those biases, address them right from the beginning, from how we're designing and developing these systems, we just end up recreating those same problems, but on a way bigger scale.
So it's not just about like making the technology itself better, more advanced. It's about making it more, I don't know, ethical, more aware of the social impact it can have.
Yes, exactly.
Hmm.
It's realizing that technology, it's never neutral. It's not objective, even if it seems like it is. It's always reflecting the values, the priorities of the people who made it.
Hmm.
And right now, it feels like we're in a place where like the voices and experiences of people who are already marginalized, they're being left out.
Yeah. It's like we're so busy trying to teach machines to talk that we've forgotten to actually listen to all the different ways humans already do.
Yeah.
And we have to remember language, it's more than just, words and grammar rules. It's part of who we are.
Right.
So if we want technology to live up to that potential we were talking about, to really connect us, it needs to be designed with everyone in mind, right?
Hmm.
We have to move past this idea of one right way to speak, one standard language, and embrace all that richness and complexity that's already out there.
That's a really powerful message. So, as we're wrapping up this deep dive here, what's like the one thing you hope our listeners take away from all of this?
I think the most important thing is to remember we have a choice in all of this. We don't have to just sit back and accept what are limitations that technology has. We can demand better. We can demand that these systems reflect the actual diversity of our world, of human experiences.
So, be informed, be critical, and make our voices heard.
Exactly. Ask questions, challenge the assumptions. Don't be afraid to rock the boat a little. How we communicate with machines, with each other, it's all connected. And how we move forward depends on us making those connections.
Definitely something to think about. Thanks for joining me for this incredible deep dive. Huge thank you to all our listeners out there for listening. We'll be back next time with another episode, another chance to explore the world around us. Until then, keep those brains buzzing, keep those conversations going.